He was the only black kid in the honors class. Quiet, perfect grades. Never missed a day. Then one morning, his test paper came back with an F, and someone else's name written on top. When he told the teacher, the response was colder than the mistake. "Are you sure it's yours?" What the school didn't know. There was a camera in the classroom, and it caught everything, but what happens next will leave you furious. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The early morning fog settled like a soft curtain over the winding streets of Southridge Estates, where sidewalks cracked beneath years of neglect and streetlights flickered with the rhythm of forgotten investment. Among the peeling fences and weather-worn stoops, a rusted yellow school bus creaked to a stop. DeShawn Carver stepped aboard, his backpack slung low, his hoodie slightly faded, and his shoes worn at the toes from months of walking to save on bus fare when the routes were down. He moved without drawing attention, navigating through the echo of conversations he wasn't invited into, finding his usual seat in the third row from the back, right beside the emergency exit, the seat nobody else wanted. He sat there every morning, pressed up against the cold window, watching the scenery shift from the hollow bones of his neighborhood to the clean landscaped perfection of Glendale Ridge. It was an unspoken transformation, a commute not just across town, but across worlds. The houses changed color and shape. The air seemed to thin with judgment. The students that boarded next were noticeably different. Brand-name backpacks, fresh sneakers, the faint scent of cologne rather than home-cooked leftovers. No one greeted DeShawn. No one asked why he never spoke. He didn't exist in their world. Not really. His silence was seen as awkwardness. His poverty, a symptom of laziness. His skin color, a quiet alarm bell no one admitted to hearing. His lunch bag wrapped in foil and plastic grocery sacks sat differently in his lap than the brown paper bags others carried, printed with names of cafes their parents picked up from before dropping them off. At Glendale Ridge Middle School, the social caste system wasn't dictated by any written rules, but it operated like a machine. Kids like DeShawn weren't part of the circuit. He kept to himself not because he feared people, but because the moment he opened his mouth, the questions came. Not questions about who he was, but why he spoke so well for someone from there. What they never saw was the notebook in his backpack, filled edge to edge with calculations far beyond his grade level. Complex equations, proofs written in tiny pencil script, and theories he constructed late into the night by the glow of his grandmother's kitchen lamp. The quietness they mistook for dullness was where brilliance lived. In a world that measured intelligence by participation and confidence by volume, DeShawn was invisible. When he walked through the school hallways, his shoulders stayed low. He moved like someone who knew not to take up space. Posters lined the lockers for clubs and activities he was never invited to join. The robotics team had tryouts last semester, but the sign-up sheet disappeared before it ever reached his homeroom. When the announcements played each morning, the same few names were praised for academic excellence. DeShawn's name was never spoken aloud, even when his math scores quietly climbed to the top percentile in the district. Inside the classroom, he sat in the far left corner, next to a squeaky radiator. The teacher rarely looked his way, unless calling roll. He didn't answer questions unless directly asked, and when he did, the class turned slightly in surprise, as if the idea of him having something intelligent to say disrupted their expectations. Sometimes, he noticed their glances, the subtle arch of brow, the way they exchanged looks like they were recalibrating a judgment. It wasn't curiosity. It was confusion that someone like him didn't fit their mold. That particular Monday started like all others. Cold air bit through the threads of his thin jacket. As he waited for the bus, he boarded, found his seat, and stared out the window as the city morphed again from decay to polish. At school, lockers slammed in rhythm, laughter echoed in familiar corners. He moved with practiced invisibility. Until third period. Math class had always been DeShawn's sanctuary. Numbers didn't ask questions. Equations didn't judge. They either worked or they didn't. He could solve in silence, and the solutions didn't require permission. He turned in his homework early, as always meticulously organized. Every answer double-checked. It was a challenge sheet the teacher passed out on Friday, labeled optional extra credit. Most ignored it. DeShawn had finished it over the weekend. The paper didn't return to his desk with a grade. Instead, it disappeared into the teacher's folder, without a word, as if it hadn't been handed in, as if it hadn't existed. No acknowledgement, no praise, The student beside him received theirs back with a red ink smiley face for attempting only half. DeShawn stared at the empty space on his desk, his fingers twitching slightly. He had spent hours perfecting that sheet. During lunch he found a quiet bench under the east staircase, the only place where nobody bothered him. He unpacked his meal, leftover cornbread, boiled greens, and a hard-boiled egg. The foil crinkled as he opened it. Down the hall, laughter echoed louder. A group of students passed by, glancing his way. One of them slowed, holding something in his hand. It was his math homework. Crumpled, torn across the center. The student dropped it beside him, without a word. DeShawn looked down at the shredded paper, recognizing his neat handwriting broken by careless fingers. The words written across the top in thick black marker said, "Ghetto Einstein." For a moment he didn't move. The weight of the paper on the concrete beside him felt heavier than it should. His stomach tightened, not from fear, but from the silent confirmation that even excellence couldn't save him from their expectations. He could outthink them, outwork them, outsolve every question on that extra credit sheet, and still be reduced to a joke wrapped in a slur. Around him, the world continued. Bells rang, shoes scuffed by, a custodian swept past without noticing him, or the paper. In that instant, the silence inside DeShawn turned sharp. Not rage, not even disappointment. Just a brutal clarity. The system wasn't broken, it was functioning exactly as designed. As he sat there staring at the wreckage of his effort, a storm brewed not in the sky but in the equations within him. A quiet resolve replaced any tears that might have come. They'd just handed him proof that no matter how perfect he played their game, they'd always find a reason to move the goalpost. That day someone tore up DeShawn's math homework and called him Ghetto Einstein. The locker room carried the thick scent of sweat and disinfectant, its narrow aisles echoing with the careless noise of teenage bravado. DeShawn Carver kept his back turned to the others, changing quickly and quietly like he always did. He knew the rules of survival here. Blend in, avoid eye contact, never give them a reason to notice. But silence didn't shield him from everything. From 2 rows behind, voices pierced the air with calculated carelessness. The laughter wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, meant to be heard by one person, and one person only. They joked about scholarships, about how certain kids didn't need to be smart to get ahead, just be from the right zip code, or check the right box. They never said his name, but they didn't need to. The intent slid through the space like smoke, impossible to contain and choking to endure. DeShawn's stomach curled inward, not from surprise, but recognition. Racism here didn't wear a hood. It wore a smile. It didn't shout. It smirked. It operated in suggestion, in inside jokes, in hallway whispers, and congratulatory slaps that somehow never landed on his shoulder. And when it did show itself outright, it was always dressed as just joking, locker room talk, or don't be so sensitive. That afternoon, the tension from the locker room still clung to DeShawn's chest like smoke in fabric. He didn't go home. He didn't go to the cafeteria. He went to the one place that used to feel untouched, Mr. Winfield's classroom. The math room had always been neutral ground. Here, numbers obeyed logic. Rules made sense. Until today, when DeShawn cautiously brought up what he overheard, hoping for guidance or even acknowledgement, Mr. Winfield didn't flinch. The older man didn't even look up from his stack of papers. His hand waved off the air like brushing away a fly, and with it any expectation that DeShawn's concern mattered. He was told to focus on his grades, not drama. The dismissal landed harder than the slur itself. For a moment, DeShawn stood frozen, unsure if he should stay or leave, but knowing clearly now which path was expected of him. His eyes shifted to the whiteboard, where today's lesson was still scribbled in half-erased chalk. It was a problem he'd solved in his head the moment it was introduced earlier, that morning. But solving it wasn't the point anymore. Being seen. He returned to his desk and opened his notebook, not to the assigned homework, but to the pages near the back, where he scribbled his real work. Advanced calculus. Theorems, not yet part of the curriculum. Self-written equations that consumed his evenings. While other kids played video games or streamed shows, DeShawn lost himself in the perfection of logic. There he wasn't black, he wasn't poor, he wasn't ignored. He just, page after page, filled with the quiet fury of someone trying to earn acknowledgement through brilliance. The margins were filled with footnotes and alternate methods. He was weeks ahead of the curriculum, maybe months, but every paper turned in returned untouched, or worse, questioned for authenticity. His potential didn't scare them. It insulted them. Mr. Winfield was once a reason DeShawn believed in the system. A veteran teacher with credentials and praise, known for supporting gifted kids. But that support had a filter. It never quite extended past a line DeShawn hadn't been invited to cross. Students from the right neighborhoods received mentoring, suggestions for enrichment camps, and letters of recommendation. DeShawn received silence. The silence now echoed louder than the slurs. It said, "You're not our problem. You're not our pride. You're not our story." By the end of the week, a bulletin went up on the math department's door. A national-level competition was coming. Students would be selected to compete at the regional qualifier and then, if successful, represent their district at the state level. The announcement was met with a burst of excitement among the top students, at least those considered top by the school's standards. DeShawn watched the crowd gather, but he stayed at the edge, knowing the list hadn't been written with him in mind. Still, a flicker of hope remained. He had submitted the extra credit. He had aced every test, even the ones graded subjectively. Maybe, just maybe, someone would finally acknowledge what he was capable of. But hope here was a dangerous thing. The following Monday, Mr. Winfield stood before the class and announced the preliminary team selections. Names were read aloud, each followed by polite claps and smirks from classmates. As the list grew, DeShawn leaned slightly forward in his seat. The tension in his chest coiled tighter with every pause, every syllable that wasn't his name. When the last name was read, the air drained from his lungs in a quiet collapse. He sat still, too still, not shocked, just resigned. Then Mr. Winfield, as if addressing the invisible doubt he hadn't acknowledged directly, made a comment that cut sharper than any omission. He said they had chosen students who were ready, and followed it with a glance toward DeShawn's corner that wasn't overt, but deliberate enough for everyone to notice. The message landed like a verdict. DeShawn wasn't ready, not because of grades, not because of skill, but because the system had already decided who deserved visibility, and he wasn't on that list. The room didn't react. No one objected. No one raised a hand. The decision had been made, and the class accepted it like fact. DeShawn sat back slowly, as though retreating into himself. His heart didn't race. It hardened. Outside the window, the sky had begun to cloud. A storm approached. One of those heavy, slow-moving Midwest fronts that rolled in without warning. In the silence of the classroom, as Mr. Winfield returned to the whiteboard, DeShawn flipped his notebook open again. Not to the page on polynomial, to the one labeled, Proof for N Variable Root Prediction. Original. A page so dense with logic, it could have filled a graduate thesis. He wasn't just good, he was extraordinary. And yet he remained invisible. The bell rang. Desks scraped. Backpacks zipped. The day moved on. But something inside DeShawn didn't. Something had cracked. Not a loud break, but a hairline fracture in the wall of patience he had built brick by brick for years. As he walked through the hallway, a few students nudged each other and chuckled, their eyes flicking toward him. He didn't need to hear the words to know their tone. Pity and mockery had a sound all their own. That night, at his grandmother's house, DeShawn stayed up late. His dinner went untouched. The numbers kept pulling him in, faster than before, like the equations themselves were begging to be released. The insult in the locker room was cruel. But the indifference from the teacher, that was the betrayal that burned. Mr. Winfield announces a national-level math challenge, and says, "We already know who's not ready for this." The day after the team selections, DeShawn walked into school carrying more than just his backpack. He carried a silent defiance, folded carefully into the crease of a freshly completed pre-calculus paper that he knew would make noise, whether praised or punished. It had taken him 4 nights. 4 nights of locking himself in his room after dinner. Hunched over the dining table with nothing but a mechanical pencil, 3 college-level textbooks from the city library, and his grandmother's lukewarm encouragement echoing through the house. He worked in silence, broken only by the scratching of graphite and the creaking of the old chair beneath him. The paper was meant for the math team tryouts, but DeShawn submitted it anyway, uninvited, unacknowledged, unbothered by the politics of permission. The assignment was a challenge-level proof, a multi-step problem that required the manipulation of nested functions and abstract reasoning, several grades ahead of what their class had been taught. Miss Winfield had mentioned it casually weeks ago, handing out a version of it to his preferred students, the ones already chosen. But DeShawn hadn't forgotten. He found the original version online, through a database used by college prep circles, stripped it down to its core logic, and rebuilt it from scratch. His solution was flawless, annotated, elegant, genius, even. But genius from the wrong person is rarely welcomed. He handed the paper in with quiet dignity, and no expectations. But by third period, whispers slithered through the corridors like smoke from a hidden fire. Some students smirked, others sneered. A few raised eyebrows and laughed when they thought he couldn't hear. By lunchtime, the news had made its way back to him. The judges who were overseeing entries for the regional math qualifier had flagged his submission for irregularities. A phrase that meant only one thing in this context. They didn't believe he could have written it. Not alone, not without help, not from Southridge. The insult was sharp not because it questioned his work, but because it assumed someone like him couldn't possibly own it. In the hallway, a cluster of students joked about it near the vending machines. They laughed louder than necessary, ensuring their voices carried. The phrases were predictable, like he wrote that himself, and bet he copied it from Reddit. One girl, holding her iced coffee like a microphone, mimed typing and said something that made the others howl with amusement. DeShawn kept walking. If he stopped, he'd shatter. Back in class, Mr. Winfield returned the rest of the class's work, but said nothing to DeShawn. His paper wasn't in the stack. There was no mention of its status, no discussion, no acknowledgement. The silence was suffocating, louder than any accusation could have been. The same teacher who once dismissed a racial Roz locker room drama now couldn't find the courtesy to say anything at all. That evening, DeShawn's mother, Angela, returned home from her cleaning shift, just after midnight. Her feet ached. Her eyes stung from the chemicals she scrubbed into floors that weren't hers. She found DeShawn awake, still dressed, sitting stiff on the living room couch. In his hand was a printout of the email the school had sent, blunt and bureaucratic, calling his submission into question, and requesting a formal academic inquiry. Angela read the words slowly, her lips pressed tight. She had always told DeShawn his brain was his ticket out. But now, even his excellence was a liability. Her instinct was to protect, but even she hesitated. The word expulsion sat heavy in the email, disguised in polite legal jargon, but clear in intent. The next morning, DeShawn arrived at school to see the damage had already taken root. His locker had been tampered with, nothing stolen, just defaced. A sticky note was left inside, folded once blank except for 3 words in crooked handwriting. "Who you foolin'?" The message didn't ask, it accused. DeShawn took it, crumpled it quietly, and stuffed it in his pocket. He didn't tell anyone. Who would he tell? Mr. Winfield had already made his position clear, and the rest of the faculty followed his lead. The gifted program coordinator hadn't returned his emails. The guidance counselor hadn't even known his name until now. Worse still was the atmosphere inside his own home. For the first time, DeShawn sensed hesitation in his mother's eyes. She loved him deeply, fiercely, but she also feared losing the fragile stability they had. An expulsion would mean transferring schools, moving, disruption they couldn't afford. He saw her studying him differently, as if trying to measure whether the truth of his mind could be proven in a way the system would accept. And then came the formal letter from the district. Typed on polished letterhead, it stated that DeShawn's assignment would undergo external review for verification of authorship. Until then, he was suspended from any academic competitions. A meeting would be held with his mother present. They did not provide a date, only said they would be in touch soon. The emotional reversal was staggering. Just a week ago, DeShawn had hoped to compete nationally. Now he was being investigated for the crime of doing too well. His intelligence had crossed an invisible line, one where black kids from poor neighborhoods aren't allowed to exist without suspicion. The twist wasn't that he was accused. That had happened before in smaller, subtler ways. The twist was how quickly it escalated the moment his brilliance outpaced the system's ability to stereotype him. One night he stood in front of the hallway mirror, studying his reflection. Not his face, but what they saw when they looked at him. The hoodie, the skin tone, the quiet posture. It didn't matter how perfect his paper was. He had broken their narrative, and now they needed to restore it. He returned to school under a haze of whispered rumors and subtle avoidance. The math room no longer felt safe. Students he once hoped would respect him now kept their distance, afraid to be associated. Mr. Winfield no longer looked in his direction. DeShawn poured himself into another project. Something deeper. A mathematical model he'd begun months ago that used adaptive algorithms to predict variable decay across nonlinear systems. He didn't know if it would prove anything to anyone, but it made him feel real again. That Thursday, he stayed late in the library. After school, the building was nearly empty, lights dimmed in sections, the custodian humming faintly in a far wing. DeShawn worked alone, cross-referencing proofs in an outdated calculus textbook. Then his phone buzzed. It was a voicemail from the district. His mother had been called for an emergency meeting. No explanation, no schedule, just urgency. The district calls his mother and demands a meeting about academic dishonesty. The voicemail from the district replayed in DeShawn's mind long after the phone stopped buzzing. Its clipped, sterile tone hung heavy over the house like storm clouds too thick to pass. His mother hadn't said much when she got home, only that they were meeting someone from the school board the next day. The silence between them was brittle. Not angry, just worn thin, like both were trying not to break something already cracked. DeShawn disappeared to his room, burying himself in unfinished notebooks and open textbooks. He didn't study to win anymore. He studied to stay grounded, to prove to himself, in numbers and logic, that he wasn't crazy, that brilliance lived in him, that they just refused to see it. But downstairs, someone else was watching the unraveling closely. Loretta Carver, his grandmother, sat in the kitchen with a cup of stale coffee and a folded newspaper she hadn't read in years. She was in her late 60s, with the soft defiance of someone who'd survived too much to be shaken by another headline. It was Loretta who raised DeShawn after his father was taken, gunned down by police in a case of mistaken identity during a stop that should have ended with a warning, not a funeral. She had seen the signs before. The shifting tones, the tight-lipped authority, the way systems wrapped themselves in procedure, while stripping a boy of his dignity. When DeShawn said nothing over dinner and stared blankly through his plate, Loretta didn't press. She just listened to the quiet, the kind that screamed. That night, as DeShawn sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting through a sea of graph paper, Loretta shuffled into the hallway closet, the one nobody used anymore. It smelled faintly of mothballs and dust. She reached behind an old sewing machine and pulled out a cardboard box, one she hadn't opened since DeShawn was in elementary school. Inside was a stack of old books from the local library's donation drive. Most were water-damaged or outdated, but one, thick and well-worn, caught her eye: Advanced Mathematical Reasoning for National Competitions. The cover was faded, corners curled like the hands of time itself. A handwritten name on the inside jacket read, "Property of Glendale Ridge Public Library." Loretta carried it to DeShawn's room without a word. When she placed it on the floor next to him, he paused, not at the book, but at the quiet authority in her eyes. She didn't have to say what she meant. He understood. The book was a bridge, not to competition, but to legacy. It had survived a decade in their home, waiting for the moment he needed it most. Flipping it open, DeShawn discovered highlighted pages, annotations in red pen, and even a folded index card that mapped out competition formats from years past. Someone had loved this book before him, studied it, trusted it, and now it was his. What struck him wasn't just the content, it was the familiarity. The problems were similar to those he had already solved in secret. Some, he realized, had been recycled into this year's regional qualifier. The patterns were there, just hidden beneath bureaucratic labeling and question formats. His instincts had been right all along. Upstairs, as rain began to whisper against the windows, Loretta returned to her chair in the kitchen. She didn't need to hover, she didn't need to fight his battles. Her job was simpler, but far more important: to remind him that he wasn't crazy, that what he carried inside him wasn't imagined, it was real, it was rare, and it was dangerous to those who couldn't control it. DeShawn read for hours that night, not for school, not for a grade, for clarity, for ammunition. Each formula reminded him that the system feared what it couldn't categorize. He wasn't just smart for a kid from Southridge, he was simply smarter, period, and that was what made them recoil. By midnight, the house had gone silent, save for the tapping of his pencil. He returned to the same type of problem. The district had accused him of plagiarizing, but this time, he stripped it of all known references. No internet, no guides, just raw logic and abstract thinking. He began sketching a new proof entirely from scratch, one that approached the same concept from a radical angle. He layered variables and shifted constants, drawing on non-standard logic theories he'd taught himself through old PDFs and lecture videos. The work consumed him, not out of desperation, but determination. It was no longer about proving them wrong. It was about reclaiming his own narrative. With every line of math etched onto the page, he wrote a rebuttal to the accusation that genius had a skin tone. As the storm outside swelled, DeShawn moved with clinical focus, stopping only to rub fatigue from his eyes. This new proof, untraceable, unconnected to any prior material, wasn't just a solution, it was a declaration. And somewhere deep in the process, something unexpected happened. He smiled. Not because the work was done, but because it reminded him of who he was before the world told him otherwise. At 3:17 a.m., he closed his notebook, slid it under his mattress, and turned off the light. That night, DeShawn locks himself in his room and writes an entirely new, untraceable proof from scratch. By the time the district finally cleared DeShawn of academic dishonesty, the damage had already calcified into something unspoken, but permanent. The email arrived with bureaucratic brevity. No apology, no retraction, just a line that read, "After further review, authorship is no longer under question." There was no assembly to correct the record. No classroom announcement to repair his reputation. Just a quiet disappearance of the accusation. Like a stain half scrubbed from a whiteboard. But the stain remained in the minds of his classmates, in their stares, in their half-smirks, in the way their conversations stopped when he entered the room. Vindication on paper did not restore what suspicion had already stolen. His locker had changed too. Someone had taken a Sharpie to the metal door, scrawling the words, "Your place ain't here." The message wasn't loud, but it was surgical. It cut deeper because it pretended to be casual. No exclamation point. No signature. Just certainty. DeShawn didn't react. He didn't report it. Reporting meant paperwork and meetings that went nowhere. He scrubbed the ink with his sleeve until the letters blurred into a black smear, then closed the locker slowly, as if sealing in the bitterness that came with it. The school halls echoed with a kind of smug balance restored. The teachers moved on. The students adjusted their jokes. The competition moved forward. And DeShawn, the boy who had dared to be too brilliant, too visible, was left to navigate a reputation that no longer belonged to him. Then came the morning the intercom buzzed with his name. It was subtle, calm, not an emergency. Just DeShawn Carver, please report to the main office. He walked there slowly, heart steady but guarded. He'd expected this call weeks ago when the accusation was still fresh, when the district inquiry loomed like a blade. But now, with the issue officially closed, the timing felt suspicious. Not disciplinary, not yet, but rehearsed. The office door was slightly ajar. Inside, Principal Rowland stood by the window, not seated behind his desk. That alone told DeShawn everything he needed to know. The conversation wouldn't be documented. This wasn't about policy. This was about power. Principal Rowland, a tall man with a reputation for being progressive in the school newsletter and neutral in practice, didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone was syrupy, a slow drip of concern wrapped in control. He spoke about how some students had expressed discomfort. He mentioned how tensions can rise when people feel threatened by unexpected change. He framed DeShawn's excellence as disruption, his proof as provocation. Then he offered a suggestion disguised as guidance. Maybe it's time to tone it down. Focus on your regular classwork. Stay in your lane. Those were the words that lodged in DeShawn's chest. Stay in your lane. It wasn't said with venom. It was said with a smile. As if safety came from silence. As if survival meant shrinking just enough to avoid further disturbance. DeShawn didn't reply. Not with words. But his silence was not surrender. It was storage. He took every syllable, every glance, and filed it deep inside the part of him that had no room left for denial. When he stepped back into the hallway, the school looked the same. Students moved between classes with earbuds in, and backpacks sagging off one shoulder. Teachers greeted others by name. Nothing had changed, except him. He moved slower, not from fear but from calculation. That afternoon, the school posted an announcement on its website and social pages. Glendale Ridge Middle School had been selected as a qualifying site for a nationally televised math competition. It was a prestigious honor. The type of thing schools bragged about in annual reports. The type of thing that could have spotlighted DeShawn as a local prodigy. Flyers went up the next day. Excitement buzzed in the air like static before lightning. Classrooms displayed countdown clocks. Teachers wore branded lanyards. The school's top math students were featured in a rotating slideshow in the front lobby. DeShawn wasn't on the list. His name wasn't even in the captions. He stood in front of the bulletin board that afternoon. backpack still strapped, eyes scanning each line of text with mechanical precision. The team members were listed by grade, alongside their assigned problem sets and rehearsal schedule. Every student on that list had scored below him on past assessments. Several had been helped by his notes, borrowed his formulas, or copied off him during in-class reviews. But there they were, smiling in photos taken without his knowledge, standing in his place. His heart didn't break. It tightened, like a fist curling around an answer no one wanted to hear. What made the omission worse was its precision. This wasn't oversight. It was erasure, a political decision dressed as logistics. He hadn't been disqualified. He had simply been unlisted, silently, cleanly, deliberately. Later that evening, he searched the school's official webpage again. A PDF of the competition guide had been uploaded. In the fine print was a clause that required all participants to be in good academic standing with no pending conduct issues. The language was vague, weaponizable. His previous inquiry, though cleared, still left a record in the system. A shadow the administration could stretch into a reason. Loretta found him later that night sitting at the kitchen table, fingers pressed tightly against his temples, eyes locked on a graph he wasn't really reading. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't need to. The pattern was obvious now. The twist wasn't that he'd been excluded. The twist was that they'd made him into a liability. Brilliance was only acceptable when it stayed within bounds, when it didn't threaten the order of things, when it came from faces and addresses that already fit the mold. DeShawn had shattered that mold, and now they were quietly collecting the pieces, sweeping his name into the corners. As the house went quiet, DeShawn returned to his room and opened a blank page in his notebook, not to solve a problem, but to design one, a question so elegant, so complex, that no one could answer it without recognizing its maker. He would not shout. He would not protest. He would let the work speak. But the system had just made a mistake. It thought he'd be silent. A nationally televised math competition selects Glendale Ridge as a qualifying site. But DeShawn's name isn't on the team list. The morning of the national math competition dawned over Glendale Ridge, with a calculated calm. The sky was cloudless, but the tension hanging in the school's hallways was unmistakable. Students filed in dressed more formally than usual. Khakis pressed, polos tucked, shoes polished. Every corner of the building buzzed with anticipation. Teachers hurried to finalize logistics while administrative staff prepped for visitors. This was Glendale Ridge's moment to shine. A prestigious hosting honor now drenched in community pride. DeShawn Carver was not on the program, not in any of the photographs posted on the school's social media, and certainly not listed among the elite competitors, but he had found a way in, wearing a lanyard marked event assistant. DeShawn moved through the school's back corridors, carrying boxes of supplies, bottled water, folders, clipboards. No one questioned his presence. To most, he was just another volunteer, someone useful, invisible, unimportant. He knew they didn't expect him to pay attention, and that was exactly why he was there. The auditorium was already set up when he arrived. Banners draped across the stage, rows of perfectly arranged chairs facing the large projection screen, tables stacked with numbered packets and testing tools. In the far corner of the room, near the edge of the risers, stood a narrow rectangular table, a desk clearly meant for volunteers or overflow materials. DeShawn quietly claimed that spot. He placed the bottled water in neat rows, arranged the handouts, and then took a seat at the edge of the table. From this vantage point, he could see everything: the stage, the judges' table, and most importantly, the projected problems on the screen. He held a clipboard in his lap, pretending to organize schedules, while his eyes locked onto each question that appeared during the opening round. They were familiar. The first two problems mirrored challenges from the old guidebook his grandmother had unearthed just days before. He remembered the solutions down to the shortcuts others would miss. But he didn't react. He sat motionless, only his pencil shifting as he scribbled thoughts. His own version of shadow participation. Then came the final round. The last question lit up on the screen, drawing a collective inhale from the crowd. Even some of the judges murmured in private, eyebrows raised at the complexity. It was designed to overwhelm, to separate the merely smart from the exceptional. DeShawn leaned forward slightly. He read the entire problem once, then again. By the third read, his stomach twisted, not from intimidation, but recognition. Something was wrong. It wasn't a mistake in the question's wording. It was in its logic. A core variable was misassigned. A coefficient buried deep in the problem's third layer contradicted its foundation. To most eyes, the error would go unnoticed, because the surface-level math still worked. But to DeShawn, who had trained his mind to seek symmetry, it stood out like a crooked tooth in an otherwise perfect smile. Quietly, he reached for a napkin tucked under the table's edge, flipped it over, and began writing. His fingers moved with a silent urgency, neither rushed nor hesitant. He adjusted the base values, realigned the equation's balance, and corrected the logic to what he believed the question was originally meant to assess. The solution took him less than 2 minutes. By the time the crowd burst into applause for a contestant named Landon, one of the school's poster boys and a faculty favorite, DeShawn had already completed his correction. He laid the napkin beside his clipboard, folded once, left unclaimed. Landon had scored 99 out of 100, the highest of the day. The auditorium swelled with praise. Teachers patted him on the back, a local reporter took notes for the press release, and school board members exchanged proud glances. They called it brilliant, but no one questioned why the supposedly flawless score had skirted past a mathematical inconsistency embedded in the question. DeShawn didn't speak. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't point out the flaw. He didn't need to. The room slowly emptied. As the event drew to a close, cameras powered down, judges packed their bags, staff began stacking chairs. DeShawn remained at his post, cleaning up, moving in near silence, unseen in plain sight. And then something unexpected happened. Dr. Evelyn Morris, a professor from the University of Illinois and a guest evaluator for the competition, stayed behind longer than most. She moved with deliberate grace, scanning the room not just with her eyes, but with practiced curiosity. Her gaze landed on the volunteer table, just for a moment before she noticed the napkin. It wasn't in the trash. It wasn't hidden. Just resting there, quietly, like it had been left by accident. She picked it up. At first her expression didn't change, but as she read through the scrawled equations, her eyes narrowed, her lips pressed together. She turned the napkin over, then back again, her mind clearly racing through the implications. What she held was not a student answer. It was a reconstruction, a correction, the kind only someone with deep mathematical insight could create, and the kind no one else had noticed. She stood there, frozen, eyes flicking across the margins. Whoever had written this didn't just solve a problem. They exposed a flaw in a question approved by multiple university-level advisors. The correction wasn't loud, but it was damning. She looked around the room, but it was already half-darkened, the final echoes of feet fading down the hallway. No name, no timestamp, just brilliance left behind like a whisper. No one was supposed to hear. She folded the napkin carefully and slid it into her leather folder. Her face was unreadable, but her body language had shifted. She no longer looked like a guest. She looked like someone who had just discovered a secret worth pursuing. Behind the curtain, just beyond the reach of stage lights, DeShawn stood still. He had watched her pick it up. He had watched her pause. And that was enough. For the first time in weeks, he felt something pierce the numbness that had wrapped itself around him since the inquiry, since the exclusion, since the hallway warning to tone it down. He felt a flicker of possibility. Not in winning, not in glory, but in being seen. Not for his story, not for his background, but for the quality of his mind. He walked home in silence that night. The napkin remained with her, and the weight in his chest felt just a little bit lighter. A university professor picks up the napkin after everyone leaves, and stops cold, long after the auditorium lights dimmed and the final chairs were folded away. The napkin sat quietly in Dr. Ellen Morris's leather folder, nestled between judging sheets and rubrics that now felt irrelevant. As she reviewed her materials at the hotel later that evening, the napkin kept drawing her attention, unassuming, handwritten, and brilliant. She had reviewed thousands of student responses across the country, but none like this. The handwriting was precise yet unpolished, clearly not rehearsed. This was raw insight, original thought, the kind that couldn't be Googled, copied, or taught. On instinct, she took a photo of the napkin and posted it to her Twitter account, anonymous, cryptic, and without identifying details. The caption read, "Today at a national-level math competition, an unregistered student sitting quietly in the corner corrected the actual exam question." Let that sink in. She didn't expect much. A few likes maybe, a niche discussion among fellow educators. But the internet had other plans. Within an hour, her tweet had been picked up by a prominent STEM educator, then a social justice page, then a black academic network with over 1 million followers. The photo of the napkin, barely lit under the glow of fluorescent lights, became digital wildfire. Someone enhanced the image, zoomed in on the equations. Others began dissecting it line by line, confirming its accuracy and debating its origin. The next wave came quickly. A blurry photo from the auditorium, snapped by a student during the event, surfaced on Reddit, showing a boy at a folding table in the far corner, hunched over something white in his hand. The grainy resolution didn't hide his posture, his skin tone, or his apparent focus. By midnight, someone had posted a close-up. By 3 a.m., DeShawn Carver's name was trending. Some unknown black kid just corrected a national question live, and nailed it. The phrasing exploded across Twitter timelines. It wasn't just about math anymore. It was about what it meant to be brilliant, black, and overlooked. Hashtags spun from the image like sparks off a match. Math while black, napkin proof, ghetto genius, not your token, correcting the system. The conversation split in two. One side praised him as a symbol of unfiltered genius. They lauded his humility, his quiet intellect, the poetry of someone rewriting the system's failures while seated at the edge of the room. Activists, educators, even celebrities began sharing the story. The other side, predictable in tone and venom, doubted his existence. They questioned the authenticity, accused it of being a stunt. Some even posted that math doesn't have race, or that this was another woke fabrication. Others mocked the name ghetto genius, while unknowingly amplifying its virality. By sunrise, the original tweet had surpassed 1.3 million views. At 6:41 a.m., DeShawn's face appeared in a collage on the homepage of a viral news blog under the headline, "Who is this napkin prodigy?" Inside his bedroom, none of this had reached him yet. DeShawn woke up the same way he always did, quietly, slowly, and before the alarm, he moved through the house with his usual rhythm, brushing his teeth, folding his blankets, and checking to see if his grandmother needed help making breakfast. She didn't mention anything. She hadn't seen it yet. Neither had his mother, who had already left for her early shift at the office park downtown. He sat down at the kitchen table and reached for his phone. His screen was a wall of notifications. Hundreds. His hands stiffened slightly. He hadn't posted anything. Not recently. Not publicly. But then he saw it. The retweets, the tags, the messages. Screenshots of him in the auditorium. Photos the napkin. Posts with his name. Some misspelled. Others circled in red. He clicked on a thread. Then another, and another. His breath stilled. There he was. His body, his work, his face picked apart by strangers across the globe. He read praise. He read praise wrapped in disbelief. He read disbelief laced with insult. One post claimed the school planted the napkin to boost its image. Another accused him of stealing the correction from an online source. None of them knew the truth. The system that had tried to erase him was now using him as a headline. It never wanted to write. Still, the overwhelming tone leaned toward awe. People were asking, who taught him? Where did he come from? How did no one notice? A few even began researching his school, his teachers, his background. Glendale Ridge Middle School's website briefly crashed under the surge of traffic. But from the school itself? Nothing. No email, no post, no statement. Silence. The same silence that had followed the false accusation. The same silence that followed the exclusion from the math team. They weren't rushing to claim him. They were calculating, figuring out how to contain the story, if they could, or whether they needed to pretend he didn't belong to them at all. Then came the shift. At 8:32 a.m., an email landed in DeShawn's inbox. The sender's name was clean and academic, bearing the crest of a top-tier university on the East Coast. The subject line was short but sharp. Opportunity to connect. Regarding your work. His thumb hovered over the message, but he never got to open it. At 8:35 a.m., the email system's administrative override, controlled by school staff for digital safety, redirected all flagged messages involving student contact with unknown external parties. The system logged the transfer. The message was pulled from DeShawn's inbox and redirected to a staff review folder. Mr. Winfield opened it. He read every word. It wasn't just praise, it was a request. An invitation for DeShawn to discuss his methods, his logic, and possibly contribute to an upcoming symposium on youth innovation in mathematics. The kind of exposure that could change everything. Mr. Winfield didn't forward the email. He didn't reply. He didn't mention it to DeShawn at all. Instead, he closed the browser, locked his screen, and walked to his next class. The napkin had made it out into the world. The proof had been seen, but the gatekeepers were still at work, quiet, composed, and dangerous in their restraint. DeShawn sat at the back of his homeroom, later that morning, unaware of the message now buried in a review queue. His classmates whispered, some nudging their phones in his direction, others pretending they hadn't seen a thing. The tension had shifted from mockery to discomfort, no longer laughter, but unease. He felt the eyes but not the opportunity. Not yet. A top university emails asking for an interview, but Mr. Winfield intercepts the message. By the end of the school day, DeShawn's photo had circled the internet faster than any announcement the school had ever made. Yet inside the cold walls of Glendale Ridge Middle School, the tone hadn't shifted. It had calcified. The teacher's lounge whispered more than it spoke. The principal's office blinds stayed closed, and behind the silence a quiet campaign was underway. Not to elevate the boy everyone was talking about, but to discredit him before the world looked too closely. The first blow came, with surgical precision. Mr. Winfield, having intercepted the university email, didn't respond to it. Instead, he scheduled a meeting with the administration behind closed doors. His report was clinical, framed in terms of data integrity and testing protocols. He claimed that DeShawn's correction of the competition's final problem was highly suspect. Then, without presenting any actual evidence, he suggested a new theory, that DeShawn may have obtained an advance copy of the exam, or worse, accessed restricted materials via a digital system. In short, he implied that the napkin proof wasn't genius. It was theft. The accusation spread through official channels faster than the tweet ever had. By the next morning, a local news affiliate had picked up the story, guided quietly by a press release from someone in the district office. The anchor's voice carried the kind of feigned neutrality that masked bias as objectivity. A Glendale Ridge student, previously praised online for a controversial math solution, may be under investigation for potential academic misconduct, the segment announced. Sources allege the student may have accessed testing materials in advance. No names were mentioned. But the photo of the napkin proof flashed on screen. DeShawn's classmates saw it within the hour. The shift in the halls was instant. Yesterday's whispers of awe turned into side eyes of suspicion. Students who had silently envied him now used the accusation as validation for their resentment. The message was clear. See? He couldn't have done that on his own. Of course he cheated. His teachers didn't step in. Not even the ones who had once praised his test scores. Not the ones who used his homework as quiet reference for grading rubrics. They had already decided that genius in someone like him was either dangerous or fake. They didn't say it. They didn't have to. Their silence roared. At home the air felt tighter. Angela, his mother, watched the news clip 5 times on a loop. Each time, her hands gripped the edge of the kitchen table tighter. She had worked 2 decades cleaning offices built by people who would never learn her name. She'd stayed up late helping DeShawn make flashcards and filled out scholarship applications long before he'd reached high school. She had told him education would save him. Now education was the weapon. She called the school, asked for clarification, asked to speak to a counselor, a principal, anyone. The calls went to voicemail. Her emails bounced back. Her messages were marked as read, but left unanswered. Loretta, sitting beside her, said nothing. She only watched DeShawn from the edge of the hallway, seeing something shift in his posture, his back straighter, his movements slower, like someone walking across broken glass. Outside the school gates, things were starting to unravel. Local activists, already aware of the viral tweet, caught wind of the accusation. They showed up with posters, signs that read, "Gifted, not guilty," and "Let the work speak." Students began filming with their phones. Parents argued with staff. Someone brought a bullhorn. Protesters chanted DeShawn's name, not for justice delivered, but for justice denied. Still, the school didn't issue a statement. The district called it an ongoing review. Reporters began digging deeper, tracing old disciplinary actions, academic records, even questioning whether DeShawn had ever been part of gifted testing programs. The fact that he hadn't was used against him, as if the system's failure to identify him justified its refusal to believe him now. The most painful part wasn't the suspicion. It was the sudden, crushing loneliness. In class, DeShawn felt the air change. Classmates turned away from him in group projects. Teachers hesitated before handing him materials. The guidance counselor, who hadn't spoken to him once all year, left a slip on his desk requesting a check-in. He didn't go. He stayed late in the library instead, flipping through problem sets no one else would touch, trying to find in math the clarity that the world refused to offer. His sanctuary was fractured. Even numbers couldn't buffer the noise now. Then came the unexpected break. Dr. Evelyn Morris, the university professor who had first tweeted the photo, was watching the story unfold with growing horror. She had followed every thread, saved every screenshot, and now realized what was happening. Her curiosity had unintentionally placed a target on DeShawn's back. She had assumed brilliance would be celebrated. She had forgotten what brilliance looked like when wrapped in black skin and born in the wrong zip code. She flew back to Glendale Ridge. No press. No warning. She walked into the district's administrative building, unannounced, folder in hand, and requested a meeting with the board. Inside that folder was the original napkin. She placed it on the conference table, followed by a letter from the competition's original exam writer, someone she had reached out to directly. The letter confirmed the question had been flawed. The coefficient was indeed off. The correction on the napkin wasn't just valid, it was necessary. Then she showed the school board members a time-stamped screenshot of the napkin post, uploaded before the solution key had even been released publicly. She showed the handwriting analysis, the original event volunteer list, and the testimony of 2 competition judges who had seen DeShawn at the event, but never received a submission from him. It was enough. Enough to dismantle the narrative. Enough to raise new questions. Enough to trigger an investigation, not into DeShawn, but into the school itself. As she left the room, she handed one last document to the district's legal office, a signed statement offering DeShawn Carver a fully funded mentorship at the university's advanced math lab, the first of its kind for a student under. She said nothing to reporters outside. She let the napkin speak for itself. Back at school, DeShawn sat alone beneath the staircase, unaware of what had just happened across town. The noise had quieted, the chants outside had died down, but inside the damage lingered. His phone buzzed with more hate than hope. His name trended, but without dignity. And then, for the first time since the tweet went viral, he received a text. Not from a friend, not from a fan, from a professor. The professor who picked up the napkin steps forward with shocking evidence of DeShawn's authenticity. The sun over downtown Chicago cracked through streaked windows like a spotlight when the doors to the university auditorium opened. Media crews, professors, local organizers, and math educators filled the room in steady waves, some curious, others skeptical, all of them buzzing with anticipation. At the front of the stage sat a podium branded with the university's seal, a table lined with printouts, and one large projection screen poised to display what had become the most debated napkin in America. The room quieted when Dr. Evelyn Morris stepped up to the microphone. Her demeanor wasn't theatrical, but the weight of her presence was unmistakable. She had been the catalyst for the storm, and now she had returned, not to apologize, but to confirm what she already knew. DeShawn Carver wasn't a fraud. He was something far more dangerous to the system that doubted him. He was a fact. Behind her, the screen flickered to life. It displayed 2 images side by side. On the left, a high-resolution photo of the original napkin DeShawn had left on the volunteer table during the competition. On the right, scanned pages from his math notebooks, submitted with consent from his family just days prior. Across every line, the similarity in handwriting was undeniable. Looped X's, the spacing of integrals, the unusual way he marked negative signs with a double tail. The markers of his work weren't forged. They were fingerprint unique. Dr. Morris didn't speak for drama. She spoke like an academic, but with controlled fire beneath her words. She outlined the original question from the competition, explained the error in the variable placement, and pointed directly to DeShawn's napkin correction that addressed the flaw not just accurately, but in a way no one else at the competition had even noticed. Then came the twist. She motioned to an assistant who brought up a third document on screen, the competition's official answer key, released 2 days after the event. A pie chart appeared, representing scoring distributions. DeShawn's correction didn't just beat the top-scoring contestant. It redefined the question itself. According to new evaluations by university scholars, his answer had exposed an internal logic failure in the national test format. He hadn't hacked anything. He had reprogrammed the question from within. The room buzzed, then burst. Reporters' hands shot up. Phones were raised. The live stream's comment section surged with reactions. Most saw it now. This wasn't a mistake. This was mastery. And DeShawn had done it with no coaching, no prep materials, no institutional access. Just raw, unfiltered brilliance. Yet miles away at Glendale Ridge Middle School, the front office sat still. The phones rang more than usual. Emails stacked up unanswered. Their homepage quietly removed all mentions of the math competition. Mr. Winfield didn't speak to any press. The principal refused to meet with parents. They weren't just avoiding the conversation. They were erasing their connection to it altogether. Inside the classrooms, students knew better. They watched the press conference on their phones beneath their desks, eyes darting to the back of the room where DeShawn sat, expression unreadable, posture unshaken. For the first time, their silence didn't feel like dismissal. It felt like tension. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just watched the live stream like everyone else. As the professor who had once picked up a forgotten napkin told the world what his school still refused to admit, he belonged. That afternoon, national media picked up the university's stream. Cable news anchors debated the implications. Education think tanks released statements. On Twitter, DeShawn's name trended again, this time not in controversy, but reverence. Napkin genius confirmed. Black brilliance, redefined. The system nearly erased him. Then he wrote the equation back. But at Glendale Ridge, no banner was hung. No congratulatory email was sent. Not even a brief mention during the school announcements. Teachers walked past him without eye contact. A few students offered nods, hesitant waves, but the energy was fractured. They were watching something historic unfold, and yet couldn't bring themselves to acknowledge the boy who had sat among them for years. Still, something had changed. People from outside the building were no longer asking if he was exceptional. They were asking why no one had seen it sooner. By that evening, DeShawn's grandmother Loretta sat across from him on the couch, the remote balanced on her knee, eyes fixed on a replay of the press conference. She didn't need a breakdown of the math. She saw something else in those charts and slides. She saw the moment the world finally said out loud what she had always known quietly. Her grandson was rare, and the world had nearly crushed him for it. Angela, DeShawn's mother, received a call that night from a national publication. They wanted a profile, a feature story, not about the controversy, but about the boy behind the work. She declined, not because she wasn't proud, but because she knew what came with sudden fame, wrapped in skin like DeShawn's. She feared what the world might try to take now that it couldn't ignore him. The following morning, DeShawn received a letter at his doorstep, delivered by courier, sealed with a red crest he didn't recognize at first. Inside was a single-page invitation from the National Math Symposium, hosted annually in D.C., attended by the country's brightest high school minds, keynote professors, and industry leaders. He had been invited to speak, not compete. Speak, to present the napkin, not as a fluke or anomaly, but as a case study in original unaided logic from an underrepresented youth mind. A section of the symposium had been restructured entirely in his honor, but the date of the invitation came with a twist. The symposium was scheduled for the same week as Glendale Ridge's final exams. Exams DeShawn had already been barred from taking earlier in the semester when the district began its investigation. No clearance had been given to reschedule. No opportunity offered to retest. And now the same system that had denied him a seat at the table wanted him to stay chained to their calendar, while others flew him toward a future they never intended him to reach. DeShawn stared at the letter, reading it over and over. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like a test, one the school hoped he'd fail by reaching too far too fast. He placed the letter on his desk, then looked over at the math textbook he hadn't opened in weeks, the one still stuck on the chapter the school never let him move past. The message was clear. One opportunity would require him to leave something else behind. DeShawn is invited to speak at the National Math Symposium on the same day as final exams he's barred from taking. The morning after DeShawn received the invitation to speak at the National Math Symposium, Glendale Ridge felt colder than usual, though not because of the weather. The halls held a new kind of tension, stretched taut like piano wire. Something had shifted, not visibly, not loudly, but beneath the everyday rhythm of passing bells and scraped chairs. A shadow followed him now. He had been on television, mentioned by name in editorials, praised by mathematicians with doctorates and million-follower platforms. But here, among his classmates and teachers, he had become something dangerous. Proof that a boy from Southridge could upend the quiet system that was never meant to include him. And now someone wanted to silence him. He opened his locker before first period, expecting nothing more than the usual tangle of textbooks and notebooks. But instead, there it was, folded in the center of the top shelf, creased deliberately, tucked neatly beneath a flyer for prom, a single sheet of lined paper. No name, no signature, just 5 words written in thick, jagged black ink. "We don't like smart-mouth ghetto trash." For a moment the words didn't register. Then, like cold water breaking over skin, they hit. His stomach clenched, his throat tightened, not from fear, but from the knowledge that this wasn't just anger anymore. It was a threat. The school's resource officer was called, but the investigation stopped short of anything meaningful. The principal labeled it a prank. Mr. Winfield, when informed, reportedly suggested it was a reaction from a place of jealousy. No fingerprints were taken. No cameras were reviewed. DeShawn was told to be vigilant, then ushered back into the routine like nothing had happened. But DeShawn knew better. This wasn't jealousy. It was a warning. And the fact that it came in the same breath as the word ghetto told him everything about the intent behind it. This wasn't about math. It never was. It was about him daring to belong somewhere he was never meant to reach. At home, Loretta's reaction was immediate. Her hands trembled as she held the note, her jaw set with the quiet fury only elders knew how to carry. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry, but she told Angela that night, with a tone heavy as stone, that this family had already buried one black man over a misunderstanding with authority. She refused to bury a boy over brilliance. She begged DeShawn not to go. She wanted him to decline the symposium invitation, said it wasn't worth the risk. Not now. Not while eyes were watching. Not while some still believed he didn't earn his place. But DeShawn sat in silence, his body still, his gaze steady. He didn't argue. He just returned to his room, unfolded the letter from the symposium again, and stared at his name, printed at the top in bold, followed by the words, "Keynote Youth Speaker." That title wasn't given. It was taken, written in napkin ink and nerves, earned through dismissal, ridicule, and denial. He had worked too hard to disappear now. That night, Angela triple-locked the front door and checked every window. Loretta made tea, but didn't drink it. She sat by the front curtain, watching headlights pass down the street, and DeShawn packed his things. The symposium was 3 days away. Word of the threat leaked online, not through the school, but through a student with a large TikTok following, who posted a video titled, "They Threatened Him," for being smart. The caption read simply, "This is why we don't speak up." The video showed DeShawn's locker, the note blurred for safety. It showed the classroom where he usually sat alone, the hallway where he walked with his head down. The clip exploded overnight. Over 300,000 views in 6 hours. The comments were filled with support, rage, disbelief, and far too many racial slurs to be coincidence. But buried in the flood of reaction was something else. A new video surfaced. Short, shaky, filmed through a cracked window at dusk. The footage showed a person in a Glendale Ridge hoodie, face obscured by the shadows of a hoodie, slipping around the side of a small house. The caption was cryptic, "Don't tell him I recorded this, but something isn't right." Viewers connected it to DeShawn within minutes. The siding of the house, the street sign, the porch furniture his grandmother had painted red every spring. It was unmistakable. It was his home, and the person in the video was trying to get in. A viral TikTok shows a rival student entering DeShawn's house while he's away. The TikTok video had only been online for 4 hours before it reached over 1 million views. It wasn't just the shadowy figure on the grainy footage that alarmed people. It was what it represented. This wasn't anonymous hate through a locker note anymore. This was physical, personal. It was someone approaching DeShawn's sanctuary, his home, his grandmother's porch, the one place untouched by the school's suspicion and the internet's volatility. Viewers dissected every second of the footage. Some swore they recognized the person's gait. Others matched the hoodie to school spirit wear sold at Glendale Ridge's student store. Online sleuths paused the video at the precise moment. The figure ducked past the porch light, capturing a still frame that showed a pair of bright sneakers, a signature pair known to be worn by one of the math team's members. The speculation ignited a different kind of fire. For many, this moment crossed the invisible line. It wasn't just about DeShawn's math abilities anymore. It wasn't about whether he cheated, or whether he deserved the symposium invitation. This was a message. Know your place, or we'll remind you. And people weren't having it. By the time DeShawn boarded the train with his mother and grandmother en route to the symposium, his phone had blown up with messages from supporters and strangers alike, offering protection, legal advice, even donations. But the school still hadn't made a statement. Not about the threat, not about the tick-tick, not even a brief acknowledgement of his departure for the National Math Symposium as a youth keynote speaker. When they arrived in D.C., the city felt like a different world. Clean, wide streets, polished marble, voices that spoke with power, as default. The event organizers treated DeShawn with quiet reverence. They handed him a name badge with speaker printed in bold across the top and assigned him a guide to walk him through security protocols. His photo was on the digital screens outside the conference center. No hoodie, no distortion, just DeShawn, mid-sentence, solving something the world tried to erase. He didn't speak until the final day. But his panel was full before the doors even opened. Back home in Southridge, silence settled over his street. Angela had called a neighbor to check the house while they were away. She didn't expect much, just a quick walkthrough, maybe a reassurance that the door was still locked. Instead, the call came with a sharp inhale on the other end of the line. The front door was kicked in, the living room torn apart, books shredded, curtains slashed, the couch overturned, and on the wall above the space where the TV once stood, written in black spray paint, were the words, "He don't belong on that stage." The vandalism was precise, personal, calculated. They hadn't stolen much, only notebooks, some of his old math work, a pair of framed photos, and oddly a trophy he won at a local science fair 2 years ago. Everything else had been destroyed or left untouched. The message was clear. This wasn't robbery. This was erasure. The neighbor, too shaken to clean, took photos and posted them online. Within minutes, the images were everywhere. One shot in particular, the painted phrase across the wall, was picked up by major news outlets. It was retweeted by public figures, shared by civil rights organizations, and reshared by influencers who had followed DeShawn's story from the beginning. They called it what it was: retaliation. The phrase "he don't belong on that stage" became a rallying cry. Protesters returned to Glendale Ridge. This time, they weren't just parents and students. They were joined by community organizers, professors, and representatives from education equity groups nationwide. The story reached Capitol Hill. A senator quoted the vandalism during a floor speech on systemic racism in education, using DeShawn's case to highlight how gifted Black youth are too often punished for their excellence. Grants were proposed. Panels were formed. Suddenly, the boy they tried to silence had become the center of a national reckoning. And yet, through it all, Glendale Ridge Middle School remained silent. The principal gave no interview. Mr. Winfield declined to comment. No student was disciplined. No name was released. Back in D.C., DeShawn stood in front of a standing room-only crowd. The stage lights didn't make him nervous. The microphones didn't tremble in his presence. He wore a navy blue hoodie with no school logo, just a stitched word his grandmother had sewn into the sleeve the night before: Worth. He didn't present a PowerPoint. He didn't read a speech. He pulled out a folded napkin from his pocket and placed it on the lectern. The room fell silent. Then he began to write. Line by line, he walked the audience through the flawed question, the variables, the assumptions. The logic he had used to untangle something others didn't even notice was broken. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't perform. When he finished, the room stood. Not because of the math, but because they saw the boy behind it. After the session, cameras followed him outside the center. A reporter asked how it felt to be at the center of such a firestorm. He didn't answer. He looked down at the pavement. Then, just barely, nodded. He hadn't come here to feel good. He came here to make sense of a system that would rather burn his home than admit it failed to see him. But when he got back to the hotel, his mother sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, face pale. There had been another video posted. This time it wasn't his locker. It wasn't his house. It was a live stream from someone inside Glendale Ridge, broadcasting a group of students in a classroom laughing as they passed around one of DeShawn's stolen notebooks. One of them tore a page out, crumpled it, and threw it at the camera. DeShawn watches a live stream of students laughing while tearing pages from his stolen notebook. The live stream of students laughing and tearing pages from DeShawn's stolen notebook echoed across the internet like a gut punch. There was no ambiguity, no denial. The school's crest was visible on the classroom door. The laughter was real, the crumpled pages, real, and the cruelty, it rang sharper than ever. But something changed in the way people responded this time. The usual doubts didn't flood the comments. The mockery was drowned out. The crowd that had once been split between curiosity and skepticism now moved in one direction, with anger, with clarity, and with purpose. This wasn't just a school incident anymore. It was an indictment of a system that had held its knee on DeShawn's brilliance from the very start. At Glendale Ridge, tension fractured the walls of silence. Students who had remained quiet during the early rumors now felt something deeper: shame. They had watched DeShawn walk those halls alone, be erased from rosters, overlooked in roll calls, suspected when he succeeded. And now they had proof that those in power weren't just failing him. They were enabling the hate. It started with one student. Then 3. By noon on the first day of final exams, 20 students got up mid-test, laid their pencils down, and walked out of the classroom. No yelling, no chanting, just the sound of chairs scraping back and doors closing behind them. Teachers shouted for them to return, but no one turned back. Word spread fast. By second period, entire classrooms emptied. By third, over 400 students stood shoulder to shoulder in the school courtyard, holding homemade signs: "Let Black brilliance live. You can't expel the truth. Books not bullets. Equity not silence." A handful of students wore plain white t-shirts with a red line drawn across the center. The line symbolized the one DeShawn had crossed, the one the school tried to punish him for. On the back of each shirt was a single word seen. News helicopters hovered overhead by the time lunch rolled around. National outlets picked up the story. Footage of the walkout aired on evening news broadcasts across the country. Reporters swarmed the school's gates, asking students why they left. They didn't need media training. They spoke the truth. This was about DeShawn, but also about every student like him, those whose brilliance was treated like a threat instead of a gift. The school released a statement by 3 p.m. It was vague, mechanical, filled with terms like unfortunate incident, student privacy, and continuing investigation. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the live stream, no mention of DeShawn. But that didn't stop the flood. By nightfall, a GoFundMe appeared online: "Support DeShawn's recovery and future." The organizer was a teacher from another district, someone who had never met him, but saw him the type of student the world too often failed to protect. Within hours, the donations passed. Within a day, 100. But while the world chanted and donated, DeShawn was absent from it all. He wasn't at the walkout. He wasn't on the live streams. He was in a hospital bed. The exhaustion that had built over weeks, through threats, accusations, press, and pressure, had finally broken his body. 2 days after the symposium, DeShawn collapsed during a return train ride home. Dehydrated, overworked, underslept. He had pushed through fear and fatigue, barely eating, barely breathing. The doctors called it complete system fatigue. His body had shut down after carrying too much for too long. He woke up surrounded by silence and the hum of machines. His mother sat in the chair beside him, her eyes red, her hands wrapped around his. Loretta stood at the window, watching the parking lot like it might shift into danger at any moment. DeShawn didn't ask what had happened. He already knew. He had read enough charts, solved enough models. Even human bodies followed equations, eventually. But when a nurse rolled in a laptop and showed him footage of the walkout, his heart did something he hadn't expected. It fluttered. For the first time, he saw kids holding signs with his name, not to mock him, not to humiliate him, but to uplift him. Students from his own school. Some he had never spoken to, others who had never spoken to him, and yet here they were, chanting for equity, for justice, for a seat he had built on his own. His fingers twitched, his throat clenched, not with sadness, with hope. He stayed in the hospital for 3 more days. No interviews, no cameras, just rest, just the sound of monitors, and the occasional beep from the IV machine. But the outside world kept moving. That's when the letter arrived, slipped in quietly, handed to his mother by a man in a navy blue blazer who wouldn't give his name. The envelope bore the gold insignia of one of the most prestigious science foundations in the world. Inside, a letter addressed to DeShawn Carver, written in formal prose, overflowing with praise. They had been watching. They wanted him. The foundation offered him a fully funded position at an international innovation summit, where young global minds collaborated on major scientific and mathematical advancements. It was beyond any opportunity DeShawn had dreamed of. Labs in Switzerland, think tanks in Berlin, teams that built real solutions, not just solved textbook problems. But the letter didn't end with the invitation. It ended with a request. For media reasons, they wrote, the foundation had an image protocol. They asked that DeShawn wear a specific style of uniform during the summit, that he avoid discussing ongoing controversies or domestic education disputes, that he keep personal politics out of any public address. They didn't say it directly, but the message was clear. You can come, but only if you leave part of yourself behind. A prestigious science foundation offers him a spot in a global summit, but only if he agrees to their image guidelines. The letter from the Science Foundation lay flat on DeShawn's hospital tray, its gold-embossed emblem shimmering beneath the fluorescent light. It was more than an opportunity. It was validation wrapped in prestige, a key to doors few ever approached, let alone open, the kind of offer that turned a high school student into a name whispered across global think tanks. But DeShawn couldn't stop rereading the final paragraph. To ensure consistent alignment with the Foundation's public messaging and global image, it began, we kindly ask participants to refrain from politicized speech, avoid commentary on personal background controversies, and maintain a uniform appearance in line with the summit's neutral presentation standards. Neutral. That word clanged like metal in his chest. They wanted him, but only if he came quietly, only if he fit their mold, only if he didn't remind the world that the very system inviting him had once tried to erase him. Angela read the letter too, standing quietly by the window of the hospital room. She didn't say much, just rubbed the edges of the paper between her fingers like she was testing its strength. Loretta didn't need to read it. She already knew. She'd seen this kind of invitation before, dressed up in excellence, drenched in conditions. 2 days later, DeShawn was discharged. The world outside hadn't slowed. His name was still trending. The school still hadn't apologized. The protest footage continued to circulate, and the invitation deadline loomed. The summit required a formal acceptance, travel arrangements, an orientation, and most importantly, compliance. They sent a wardrobe list. They sent talking points. They sent a social media silence clause. The foundation didn't want a prodigy from Southridge. They wanted a sanitized success story. They wanted a headline without a struggle, a genius without scars, a boy without Southridge in his voice. DeShawn stood in front of the mirror at home, holding the suit they'd couriered, charcoal gray, stiff at the shoulders, with a white shirt and a navy tie. Nothing about it resembled him. It wasn't the fabric, it was the silence it demanded, the erasure it enforced. And yet, the weight of opportunity pressed hard. People like him didn't get chances like this twice. And still, he remembered the hallway where "Your place ain't here" had been scribbled in marker. The napkin, the accusations. The day they took his notebooks and laughed into a live stream as they tore through his thoughts like junk mail. He remembered his grandmother's voice when she first called him bright, long before a test score did. He remembered the walkout, and he remembered the napkin, never meant to be found, now framed across continents.
That night he made a decision.
At the orientation event, held in a private conference suite of a DC hotel, DeShawn showed up 15 minutes early, not in their uniform, not in the suit. He wore his own clothes, a deep black hoodie, faded jeans. And across the front of the hoodie, in bold white font, were 3 words, "Not your narrative." The other youth attendees watched as he entered. Some nodded, some looked away. The organizers froze when they saw him. A program director approached with cautious concern. They gestured to the wardrobe list, whispered about brand integrity, politely reminded him of the guidelines. Then, finally, asked him to either comply or excuse himself. DeShawn didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He turned around and walked out. No statement, no performance, just truth. But by the time he reached the elevator, he pulled out his phone, took a photo of the hoodie, then posted a single sentence to his social media accounts. "If I have to erase where I came from, I'm not really there." The post ignited like dry brush in a lightning storm. Thousands of shares within minutes. Tens of thousands within the hour. Supporters across every corner of the internet posted their own images wearing black hoodies. Educators reshared the quote alongside lesson plans. Celebrities screenshot it and praised him. Activists painted murals with his words. The phrase became a movement. News anchors debated whether institutions should require neutrality from students whose lives were anything but neutral. Commentators discussed the quiet racism of erasure, how asking black excellence to come without history was another form of control. DeShawn watched the numbers climb from his bedroom, overwhelmed but still steady. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He simply watched the truth be seen. Then came the email. This one from a name he didn't expect. Netflix Originals. Youth Documentaries Division. The subject line read, "We want to tell your story." The message was short, direct. They had followed his journey. They believed his voice mattered. They wanted to produce a full-length documentary about his experience. Not just the math, but the injustice, the racism, the vandalism, the resilience. They would fund it. They would back him. They would keep his story in his voice. It was everything he had fought for. But the final sentence was chilling. "Please be advised, your former school is threatening legal action if named or shown. Netflix offers to produce a documentary about his journey, but the school threatens to sue if named." The letter from Netflix sat unopened on DeShawn's desk for 2 full days. Not because he didn't want it, but because of what came with it. The school's legal threat had been blunt. If any identifiable images, names, or events from Glendale Ridge appeared in the documentary, they would pursue litigation for defamation, even if everything shown was true. But DeShawn wasn't shaken. He had lived through worse than lawsuits. Instead, he asked himself a question that had nothing to do with lawyers or permissions. What story do I want to tell if no one can stop me? And he found the answer not in a classroom, not on a stage, not in a streaming deal, but in the look on his grandmother's face when she told him, "They tried to shrink you because they didn't know how to carry you." The world had offered him spotlights, but what he needed was infrastructure. A way to catch other kids before they were erased, like he nearly had been. A space where genius didn't have to pass through pain to be seen. So at 17, DeShawn launched a nonprofit called Margin of Error. It began with a single room inside a donated library space, 2 plastic tables, 1 donated whiteboard, and a list of names, handwritten on a loose-leaf sheet. He didn't start with coding camps or robotics competitions. He started with food, a quiet place, free Wi-Fi, a chair for every kid who had ever been told to tone it down or wait their turn. The mission was simple: find the kids the system couldn't see and show them how to build their own. Within 6 months, the nonprofit expanded into 3 cities. Within a year, it was national. The name Margin of Error wasn't just clever branding. It was a truth DeShawn knew too well. Students like him were always expected to be perfect just to be believed. One mistake, one misstep, and they were labeled lazy, dishonest, or dangerous. But others, they were allowed a margin of error the system never gave to Black brilliance. The organization offered free advanced math programs, mentorships, and microgrants to underrepresented students in underserved districts. But it also trained teachers, advised school boards, built toolkits to address implicit bias in gifted and talented programs. It didn't just support students, it rewired the architecture of the system around them. Loretta came to every opening ceremony, sat front row in every launch. She didn't speak publicly. She didn't need to. Her presence was a testimony. When interviewed for an anniversary video montage, she said one sentence and one only. They tried to make him feel small, but he solved something bigger than math. That clip opened every promotional video. It played over slow-motion footage of kids in hoodies solving differential equations, of brown hands scribbling in margins, of girls designing bridges in simulations with headphones on, mouths pressed in focus. Margin of Error became a national conversation, but not everyone celebrated. Districts pushed back. Some called the program too political. Others said it highlighted divisions instead of unity. There were critics on every platform, mostly anonymous, claiming DeShawn was exploiting victimhood or writing a moment too long. But none of them could stop the numbers, or the stories, or the faces of kids who were finally being told yes, instead of prove it. DeShawn didn't respond to the criticism. He responded by scaling. He licensed the program in 10 more cities. Then came the email. Not from a donor, not from a fan, from the National Education Standards Board, the same governing body responsible for authoring and approving the original national competition questions. The subject line read, "Re 2025 Standards Revision Committee Invite." The body of the email explained that the board was in the process of rewriting the next set of national math questions for gifted youth competitions. And for the first time in its history, they were including a student voice, not just as feedback, but as authorship. They wanted DeShawn to write a question. Not just any question. They wanted him to rewrite the exact question that changed his life. The one that had been flawed. The one he'd corrected on a napkin. The one the world had once accused him of stealing. Now they wanted that question to carry his logic, his name, his voice. It was symbolic, but also revolutionary. The system that had nearly swallowed him whole now asked him to design it from the inside. DeShawn stared at the screen in silence, his eyes flicking from sentence to sentence. This wasn't just a full circle moment. It was the moment the circle cracked open. He didn't reply right away. He closed his laptop and walked to the window, staring out over the street, where he used to walk with his head down. The cracked sidewalk, the bent stop sign, the same light that flickered every few minutes. Somehow, everything had changed, and nothing. Back at the desk, his inbox pinged again. A follow-up from the board. We are honored to finally recognize the mind that reshaped our question. We hope you will consider placing your name where it always belonged. The National Education Board invites DeShawn to rewrite the very question that changed his life. The auditorium lights dimmed slowly, casting a soft amber hue across the vast room. Every seat was filled. Rows of educators, policymakers, students, and press sat shoulder to shoulder. It was a national conference on educational reform, but this session wasn't about policy briefings or budgetary charts. It was about one boy, one moment, one equation. The screen behind the stage flickered to life. Across it flashed 5 words, bold and unmistakable. The final equation. Live demo. Then DeShawn Carver stepped onto the stage. He didn't walk like a celebrity. He didn't dress like an academic. He wore his hoodie, his own name stitched into the sleeve by Loretta's hands, and carried only a folded sheet of paper in his palm. He stood behind the glass podium, looked out at the crowd, and paused, not from nerves, but from the weight of the moment. 2 years ago, they tried to bury him in suspicion, strip him down to a caricature. Gifted if guided, brilliant if borrowed, exceptional if explained away. Now he was here not to prove himself, but to rewrite the moment they once tried to erase. A moderator introduced him briefly, noting his invitation by the National Education Standards Board to craft a new problem, one that would replace the flawed question he had corrected on a napkin. But there was no talk of injustice, no mention of the threats, the vandalism, the erased name. They left that history in the dark, hoping it would stay there. But DeShawn brought it with him. He unfolded the paper, and on the screen appeared the question. His question. Elegant in its complexity, deceptively simple at a glance, but rooted in a logic system that favored layered thinking, not rote memorization. It was a proof challenge, one with a misleading hypothesis that could only be solved by questioning the structure of the prompt itself. He wrote in silence. Each stroke of the marker on the digital board echoed across the room like a drumbeat. Line by line, he deconstructed the variables, flipped the dimensions, and built something new in real time. Not just solving, but narrating through the very method they once dismissed as too advanced to be his. Camera flashes sparked, phones recorded, but DeShawn didn't break rhythm. As he reached the final line, 2 steps ahead of where most students would have stopped, he paused once more. The equation was solved, but he wasn't finished. He turned to the audience, marker still in hand, voice quiet but anchored by years of being ignored. This was never about math, he said. It was about being seen. There was no applause, not yet. The words landed in the silence, heavy and precise. A moment passed, then another, and then a standing ovation. It didn't start at the front rows with the dignitaries. It started in the back, from the students, the ones who had watched DeShawn become something no textbook ever taught them to expect. The ones who wore their own brilliance, like armor, and silence like survival. People rose to their feet, not for the math, but for the boy who solved more than a question, who solved a system that had long insisted it was too complex to change. DeShawn didn't bow, he didn't wave. He just stepped back from the board and let the solution stand. Later that evening, away from the cameras and microphones, in a quiet gallery at the National Museum of American Progress, a small exhibit was being installed. No grand ceremony, no ribbon cutting, just a single spotlight, and under it, a simple glass frame. Inside the frame, pressed gently between preservation sheets, was a crumpled, coffee-stained napkin. No plaque, no name, no date, just the raw ink of an idea written in the margins of dismissal. The real napkin, the one that started everything. Still anonymous, still unlabeled, still fighting, silently, to be believed. As the screen goes black, the real napkin is framed on a museum wall. Unlabeled, anonymous, still fighting to be believed. Some stories aren't just stories, they're warnings. They show us what happens when brilliance is ignored, when silence is rewarded, and when racism hides behind policies and polite smiles. If you believe no child should have to prove they're human to be seen, type yes. If you believe in justice, subscribe if this broke your heart.